Security escorted Michael Carter toward the exit as his little daughter held his hand.
Bring him back.
Sir.
He's just a rejected applicant.
Only 15 minutes earlier, the same man had been publicly humiliated by senior executives, accused of wasting the company's time, and escorted out of the building after being rejected for an operations management position. Some employees had laughed as security led him toward the exit, convinced he was simply another desperate applicant who had aimed far above his place. Now those same faces had turned pale. The chairman slowly took his seat at the head of the table before asking the stranger to sit beside him instead of with the visitors. A silence so deep settled across the room that the ticking wall clock became impossible to ignore. The rejected candidate gently smiled at his daughter, reassuring her that everything would be fine, while several directors exchanged nervous glances, struggling to understand why the founder himself had personally brought this man back. Moments earlier, the receptionist who had watched the entire incident whispered to another employee that she had never seen the chairman interrupt an emergency board meeting for anyone in over 30 years. Yet here he was, delaying million-dollar decisions because of a single father everyone else had dismissed without a second thought. The human resources director quietly reached for the rejected applicant's file, only to discover that several confidential pages had suddenly been added after his departure. Her hands began to shake as she read the first line, then she quickly closed the folder before anyone beside her could see its contents. Across the table, the operations vice president swallowed hard, remembering the sarcastic remarks he had made less than an hour earlier about the man's worn briefcase and outdated resume. No one noticed the founder studying every face in the room, almost as if he were measuring character instead of business performance. Finally, he folded his hands together and spoke in a steady voice that carried through every corner of the boardroom. "Before we discuss this company's future," he said, "there is one mistake that must be corrected first." Every executive held their breath, completely unaware that the next few minutes would expose a truth capable of destroying powerful careers, changing one family's life forever, and proving that the greatest value a person brings into a room is something no expensive suit, impressive title, or billion-dollar balance sheet can ever buy. Michael Carter had not always been the calm, confident man people would later admire. 15 years earlier, he was simply a hard-working husband with a modest engineering job and a small apartment where laughter filled every corner. His wife, Rachel, believed in expensive dinners, luxury brands, and the image of success more than the quiet effort it took to build a stable life. Michael believed that wealth should come from patience, integrity, and meaningful work. Those opposite views slowly created invisible cracks in their marriage. Every month became another argument about money. Rachel compared him to friends who drove imported cars or lived in larger houses, while Michael reminded her that debt could never replace peace of mind. Instead of celebrating small victories, she focused on everything they still lacked. Michael worked overtime, accepted freelance software projects at night, and sacrificed sleep hoping to give them a better future, but every extra hour only seemed to raise expectations. Then came the worst year of his life. The company where he had worked for nearly a decade announced major layoffs after losing several international contracts. Michael walked out carrying a cardboard box containing a family photograph, a coffee mug, and years of dedication reduced to a final paycheck. He searched tirelessly for another opportunity, attending interviews across the city, only to hear the same polite rejection. Savings disappeared faster than he expected, bills piled up, and the pressure inside their home became unbearable. Rachel's disappointment slowly turned into resentment. She stopped seeing the man who never gave up and only saw someone who had failed to provide the lifestyle she wanted. One rainy evening, after another heated argument, she placed divorce papers on the kitchen table. Her decision sounded rehearsed, almost emotionless. She told him she refused to spend her life waiting for dreams that might never come true. Michael didn't argue or beg. He quietly signed the papers, believing that forcing someone to stay would never create happiness. Within weeks, Rachel married Victor Hayes, a wealthy real estate investor whose luxury cars and lavish lifestyle seemed to promise everything she had ever desired. Friends whispered that Michael's life was finished, convinced he would never recover from losing both his marriage and his career. They didn't know what happened after the silence. Every rejection, every insult, and every lonely night became fuel instead of defeat. Michael rented a tiny apartment, sold nearly everything he owned, and transformed the spare bedroom into a makeshift workspace with an aging laptop, a folding desk, and endless notebooks filled with business ideas. While the world believed his story had ended, Michael was quietly beginning the chapter that would change everything. He made himself one promise before sunrise each morning. He would never chase revenge, only excellence, because success built with character would always outlast success built on appearances. The security team led Michael Carter through a quiet hallway instead of the crowded reception area. Every employee who noticed the unusual escort stopped what they were doing. Conversations faded into whispers as they watched the rejected candidate disappear behind a set of polished wooden doors marked Executive Conference Room. Nobody understood why the CEO had personally rushed outside to bring back a man who had just been turned away. Inside the room, Daniel Bennett remained standing instead of taking his seat at the head of the table. His expression was calm, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that immediately changed the atmosphere. The executives exchanged uncertain glances, wondering what they had missed. Michael sat silently, placing his old leather briefcase beside his chair, never asking why he had been called back. Daniel slowly slid a thick cream-colored envelope across the table. It carried the faded seal of Lawson Global Holdings and looked as though it had been carefully preserved for years. "Before anyone says another word," Daniel said quietly, "I think everyone here deserves to see this." Richard Lawson, the elderly founder of the company, leaned forward with surprising interest. "Open it," he said. Daniel unfolded the handwritten letter and began reading. The room became completely silent. The letter described an incident from nearly 15 years earlier, when a junior warehouse supervisor had discovered a financial discrepancy involving a shipment worth millions of dollars. Instead of ignoring it or accepting a generous bribe to remain silent, the employee had reported everything, even though doing so nearly cost him his career. The writer praised the young man's integrity, describing him as someone who would rather lose his job than compromise his principles. At the bottom of the page appeared a familiar signature from a retired board chairman whose judgment had always been respected. Then Daniel looked directly at Michael. "That employee was you." Several executives immediately turned toward Michael with disbelief. Moments earlier they had seen nothing more than an ordinary applicant in an inexpensive suit. Now they were struggling to connect the quiet man before them with the remarkable story they had just heard. Sophia Bennett's confident expression slowly disappeared. She remembered dismissing Michael's application within minutes because his appearance failed to match the image she wanted for senior leadership. Richard Lawson carefully removed his glasses and studied Michael with renewed curiosity. "I remember hearing about that investigation," he said softly. Very few people knew the name of the man who protected this company when nobody was watching. Michael remained completely composed. "I only did what I believed was right," he answered. Daniel nodded but did not smile. "Integrity like that doesn't disappear with time. The real question is why someone with a record like yours walked into our headquarters today carrying a resume that hides almost everything about who you really are." The room fell silent once again as every eye focused on Michael, realizing the biggest mystery had only just begun. Michael sat quietly as the room slowly emptied, but Richard Lawson remained standing near the window, looking out over the city skyline. After a long silence, the elderly founder finally turned around and spoke with a calm voice. "You're probably wondering why I asked Daniel to bring you back after the interview was already over." Michael nodded, but said nothing. Richard walked toward the conference table and placed a worn leather folder in front of him. Inside were documents, handwritten notes, and a letter dated almost 15 years earlier. Michael immediately recognized the signature at the bottom. It belonged to his late mentor, Thomas Carter, the operations director who had given him his very first management job. Richard smiled faintly. "Thomas and I worked together for decades. Before he retired, he told me that if he ever had to trust one person with a company's future, it would be you." Michael looked down at the letter, unable to hide his surprise. Thomas had never mentioned writing it. Richard continued. "He wasn't impressed by intelligence alone. He admired integrity. He wrote about the time you admitted a mistake that could have been hidden, even though it nearly cost you your promotion. He wrote about how you stayed overnight during a warehouse emergency while everyone else went home. He wrote that you treated every employee, from cleaners to executives, with the same respect." Daniel Bennett listened silently, realizing this conversation explained everything he had never understood. Richard wasn't searching for another executive with an impressive resume. He had been searching for someone whose character had already been tested long before success ever arrived. Richard slowly closed the folder and looked directly at Michael. The interview today was never only about qualifications, it was about confirming whether the man Thomas described still existed. Michael lowered his eyes for a moment before answering honestly. "Life changed me, but it never changed my values." Richard nodded with satisfaction. "That's exactly what I hoped to hear." He then revealed something that surprised everyone in the room. Over the past year, Lawson Global Holdings had quietly lost several major clients, not because of poor products, but because trust inside the company had disappeared. Managers were competing against each other instead of working together. Honest employees were leaving while politics rewarded the loudest voices. Richard admitted that profits could always recover, but once integrity disappeared, rebuilding a company's reputation became far more difficult. That was the real reason Michael had been brought back. They didn't need another manager. They needed someone capable of restoring a culture where honesty mattered more than titles, respect mattered more than power, and leadership was earned through actions rather than authority. As Michael closed the folder, he finally understood that this opportunity had never been about changing his life. It was about changing the future of an entire company. Daniel had barely settled into his new role when a far more dangerous challenge appeared. The internal investigation exposed that the missing shipment had never been an isolated incident. Rebecca Lawson and the corporate compliance team uncovered records showing that similar inventory losses had been quietly occurring for almost 4 years. Every suspicious report had followed the same pattern. Evidence disappeared, warehouse cameras conveniently stopped working, and honest employees were blamed before anyone looked deeper. This time, however, Daniel's detailed warehouse notes connected incidents that no one else had ever linked together. The company immediately suspended several senior managers, while forensic accountants examined thousands of financial transactions. News of the investigation spread through the corporate headquarters, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Employees whispered in hallways, executives avoided eye contact during meetings, and everyone wondered how far the corruption actually reached. But the people responsible had no intention of quietly accepting defeat. One evening, as Daniel walked toward his car after work, he discovered the tires had been slashed and an anonymous envelope resting beneath the windshield wiper. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a chilling message. "Some mistakes can't be undone. Walk away before your daughter pays the price." Daniel's heartbeat froze for a moment. The threat wasn't aimed at his career anymore. It was aimed at Lily. That night he drove home without revealing his fear, smiling as Lily excitedly showed him her school project. But once she had gone to bed, he immediately contacted Rebecca. Within hours, corporate security arranged protection around Daniel's home, while local authorities opened a criminal investigation into the intimidation attempt. Rebecca refused to let the threats slow the investigation. Instead, she accelerated it. Digital forensic specialists recovered deleted emails from company servers, uncovering secret conversations between warehouse executives and an outside logistics contractor. Millions of dollars had been hidden through fake inventory adjustments, inflated transportation invoices, and false insurance claims. Daniel realized that exposing one missing shipment had accidentally uncovered an organized corporate fraud operation worth tens of millions. The people behind it had powerful connections, expensive lawyers, and every reason to silence anyone standing in their way. Despite the growing danger, Daniel refused to back down. He remembered the humiliation of losing his job, the nights Lily had pretended not to notice empty cupboards, and the promise he had made to himself that honesty would never become something he regretted. Looking across the conference table at Rebecca, he spoke with complete confidence. "If we stop now, they'll do this to someone else." Rebecca nodded without hesitation. "Then we finish it." Neither of them realized that the mastermind behind the entire scheme had just learned Daniel was still alive, still fighting, and had already begun planning one final move that would either destroy the company forever or expose every single person involved. The weeks that followed transformed the company in ways no one had expected. New leadership policies were introduced, anonymous reporting systems were installed, and every employee, from interns to senior executives, was invited to speak openly without fear of retaliation. Michael Carter worked tirelessly alongside the transition team, not from a luxurious executive office, but from the same operations floor where he had once been dismissed as unimportant. Employees noticed that despite his authority, he still greeted the cleaning staff by name, thanked warehouse workers after long shifts, and stayed late whenever a department faced deadlines. His actions quietly restored trust that had been missing for years. Then, just as stability seemed within reach, the board presented Michael with an extraordinary proposal. They wanted to reward him for exposing the corruption, protecting the company's reputation, and preventing millions of dollars in future losses. The package included a massive performance bonus, company shares worth several $1 million, a luxury penthouse overlooking the city skyline, and a long-term executive contract that guaranteed wealth for generations. To everyone in the boardroom, the decision felt obvious. They believed no one deserved it more. But after reading the offer in complete silence, Michael slowly closed the folder and slid it back across the polished table. Confused faces filled the room. One director finally asked, "Is something missing?" Michael smiled gently before answering, "No, everything is here. That's exactly why I can't accept it." The room fell silent. He explained that accepting such a reward immediately after exposing internal failures would send the wrong message to thousands of employees who had remained honest despite years of poor leadership. He reminded the board that integrity should never become a business transaction. Instead, he proposed something no one expected. The money allocated for his bonus should be redirected into a permanent employee support and development fund. The program would provide scholarships for workers' children, emergency financial assistance for families facing hardship, professional training opportunities, and mental health counseling for employees struggling in silence. He also requested that part of the executive housing budget be used to modernize outdated warehouse safety equipment that workers had been requesting for years. Several board members exchanged stunned glances. They had negotiated with powerful executives throughout their careers, but none had voluntarily walked away from personal fortune to improve the lives of strangers. News of Michael's decision spread through the company within hours. Warehouse staff applauded when they heard the announcement. Office employees stood together in spontaneous applause as he walked through the corridors. Even those who had doubted him from the beginning realized they were witnessing something far greater than corporate success. Michael had sacrificed personal wealth to prove that true leadership was measured not by what someone gained, but by what they were willing to give away so that others could stand taller beside them. At exactly 10 o'clock the following morning, the executive boardroom was filled with uneasy silence. Every senior manager, department head, and board member sat around the polished oak table, waiting for the emergency session to begin. No one dared to speak louder than a whisper, because everyone already knew rumors had spread throughout the company overnight. Sophia Bennett sat perfectly still, trying to appear confident, but the trembling of her fingers against her notebook betrayed the fear she refused to admit. David Reynolds quietly organized several folders beside him, while Richard Lawson remained calm at the head of the table, observing every face in the room. Then the doors opened. Michael Carter entered with his daughter Emma walking beside him for a brief moment before she smiled proudly and waited outside with an assistant. Michael wore the same simple navy blue suit that many had silently judged during his interview, yet today every pair of eyes followed him with respect instead of pity. Richard slowly stood. "Ladies and gentlemen, before this meeting continues, there is something every one of you deserves to know." He invited Michael to stand beside him before revealing the original recommendation letter written years earlier, describing Michael as a man whose integrity could never be bought. Richard explained that he had quietly followed Michael's career ever since, watching how he treated co-workers, customers, and even strangers despite facing personal hardship. He admitted that the recent interview process had been designed not only to evaluate professional ability, but also to expose weaknesses within the company's leadership culture. The room became completely silent. Richard then turned towards Sophia. "You rejected the most qualified candidate because you judged appearance instead of character. You ignored evidence, discouraged honesty, and placed your own assumptions above the values this company was built upon." Sophia attempted to defend herself, insisting she had followed normal hiring procedures, but David calmly projected security footage, interview records, internal emails, and evaluation reports onto the large screen. Every document confirmed that Michael had consistently received the highest scores, while negative comments about his clothing and financial situation had influenced the final decision. The evidence left no room for excuses. Richard announced that Sophia was being removed from her executive position effective immediately, pending further review by the board. A heavy silence settled over the room as security respectfully escorted her out without resistance. Richard then faced Michael once again. "This company doesn't need people who simply manage departments. It needs leaders who inspire trust." Before the entire board, he officially appointed Michael Carter as Executive Director of Leadership and Operations, granting him full authority to rebuild hiring standards, strengthen employee development, and create a culture where character carried more weight than status. The board members rose one after another in unanimous applause. Michael looked around the room before speaking softly. Success means very little if it comes at the cost of fairness. From today forward, no hardworking person will ever be overlooked here because of what they wear, where they came from, or what others assume about them. His words echoed across the boardroom, marking the beginning of a company transformed not by wealth or power, but by integrity that every employee would remember for years to come. The first light of morning spread across the city as Michael Carter stood outside the headquarters of Lawson Global Holdings, watching employees arrive with a renewed sense of purpose. The building looked exactly the same, yet everything inside had changed. Fear had been replaced by respect. Gossip had been replaced by accountability. People no longer whispered about power, they spoke about integrity. Michael smiled quietly, not because he had won, but because justice had finally found its place. He remembered the rainy afternoon when he had walked through those same doors carrying nothing but an old briefcase, hoping for one opportunity to provide a better future for his daughter, Emma. Back then, rejection had felt like another closed chapter in a difficult life. Today, he understood that every setback had been preparing him for something greater than success. It had been shaping his character. Inside the company, new leadership policies were already making a difference. Promotions would now be earned through merit, every complaint would be investigated fairly, and every employee, regardless of title, would be treated with dignity. Richard Lawson personally thanked the staff for believing that the company could become stronger through honesty rather than fear. As people applauded, many glanced toward Michael with genuine admiration, knowing that one man's courage had inspired an entire organization to change. Later that evening, Michael picked Emma up from school. She ran into his arms with the same bright smile that had carried him through his darkest years. "Did everything work out, Dad?" she asked. Michael looked into her hopeful eyes and nodded. "Yes," he replied softly, because the truth never stops fighting even when people stop believing in it. Emma wrapped her arms around him, proud not because of his new position or the respect he had earned, but because she knew her father had never sacrificed his principles to reach the top. They drove home as the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, reminding Michael that every storm eventually gives way to light. Wealth had given him comfort, but character had given him peace. Reputation had opened doors, but kindness had earned lasting respect. Looking out across the city skyline, Michael realized the greatest victory was never proving others wrong. It was refusing to become like those who had doubted him. Somewhere inside the company, a young employee who had witnessed everything was choosing honesty over shortcuts because of Michael's example. That single decision could change another life, then another, creating a legacy far greater than any business empire. As the screen slowly faded to black, one simple truth remained: people may underestimate your appearance, your past, or your circumstances, but they can never defeat a person who refuses to abandon integrity. Sometimes life delays justice, but it never forgets it. And in the end, the richest people are not those who own the most. They are the ones who leave behind a legacy of honor, compassion, and unwavering truth.